In 1983, Gene Simmons met Shannon Tweed at the Playboy Mansion. It took him almost 3 decades to marry her, but when they finally did in 2011, it wasn't really about romance. The wedding was meant to cover up a scandal that threatened to destroy his family. Recently uncovered footage from their reality show revealed conversations that were never meant for the public. At the same time, his son was caught in a plagiarism controversy, and legal documents from 2025 even mentioned incidents involving female employees. The man who once bragged about sleeping with 4,800 women was suddenly facing consequences that went far beyond his wild public image. Gene Simmons wasn't born Gene Simmons. His real name was Chaim Witz, and he was born on August 25, 1949, in Haifa, Israel. His life started with hardship. His mother, Flora Klein, was a Holocaust survivor from Hungary. Born in 1925, she was only a teenager when she was forced into Nazi labor camps, where she picked potatoes under armed guard and watched her family disappear. She rarely spoke about what happened, but her silence and her tears told the story. His father, Yehiel Witz, also escaped from Hungary, and together they married in 1946 before moving to Israel in 1947. Their past was filled with trauma, and that pain would quietly shape everything in Gene's life. When Gene was 6 years old, his parents' marriage collapsed. Money was one of the biggest problems. His father stayed in Israel and started a new life, but Flora raised Gene alone in Mount Carmel. She worked tirelessly in factories sewing buttons just to put food on the table. Sometimes dinner was nothing more than bread and milk. To help, young Chaim picked wild fruit with a friend and sold it by the roadside. He made his first winter coat out of an old army blanket because they couldn't afford real clothing. Nights were often lonely. His mother worked late, and he cried himself to sleep in an empty home. School wasn't much better. He was bullied for being different, even in Israel, where you might think everyone understood hardship. He carried the shadow of his mother's pain without fully realizing it. But he also found something that saved him: comic books. American superheroes like Spider-Man and Superman became his escape. He couldn't even read English yet, but he tried anyway. By age 7, he spoke Hebrew, Hungarian, and Turkish, and he was secretly teaching himself English just to understand the stories in those comics. In 1957, Flora made a bold decision. With almost no money, she took 8-year-old Chaim to the United States. They settled in Queens, New York, and started over with nothing. His father stayed behind in Israel, remarried, and Gene never saw him again. America was a shock. Flush toilets, TV dinners, things he had never seen before. But survival was still a daily struggle. Flora worked 15-hour shifts in factories, and Gene had to grow up quickly, often spending time with babysitters or fending for himself. At first, kids teased him for his heavy accent. He felt like an outsider everywhere he went, but instead of breaking down, he pushed harder. He sold cactuses door to door, just like he had sold fruit in Israel. He studied English by watching television and reading more comics. He became obsessed with American pop culture. By age 9, he legally changed his name to Gene Klein, inspired by cowboy stars like Gene Autry. He wanted to be fully American now. The Ed Sullivan Show became his window into the dream he wanted. When the Beatles performed on February 9, 1964, he was electrified. He knew he wanted to be on stage. He wanted to be famous, admired, and powerful. Sometimes he even faked a British accent to charm people, copying the Beatles. Girls liked it, and little by little, his confidence grew. In the 1960s, he worked any job he could get. He sliced meat in butcher shops, worked in delis, and earned just over $1 an hour, saving every penny. Poverty had made him careful with money. He also stayed away from drinking and drugs. He noticed how sloppy people became when they drank, and he made a choice. He would stay sharp and use that to his advantage. That's how he stood out, even around women. Music soon became his real focus. Inspired by the Beatles, he learned guitar and started forming small bands while still in high school. After graduating from Newtown High School in 1967, He went to Sullivan County Community College. He earned an associate degree in education in 1970 and even taught 6th grade in Spanish Harlem for $75 a week. But his heart wasn't in teaching. He wanted something bigger. He joined forces with Paul Stanley and started a band called Rainbow, which later became Wicked Lester in 1970. They played clubs at night while working other jobs during the day. Gene even worked at a fashion magazine for a while to support himself. All of this was building toward something much larger. His transformation into Gene Simmons, the rock icon who would one day wear black leather, spit fire, and become known around the world. Gene Simmons didn't just scrape by with odd jobs like selling cactuses or working in butcher shops. He also used his language skills to make extra money. Thanks to the Hungarian, Turkish, and Spanish he had picked up as a child from babysitters and neighbors, he found translation gigs to keep himself afloat. But no matter what he did for work, his heart was always in music. He tried different styles, experimented with sounds, and even recorded some solo songs under his own name. Through it all, he never forgot his mother. He sent her money whenever he could, always carrying the weight of her survival and the family she had lost in 1945. There was also a part of his life story that shocked even longtime fans. Gene has said that he lost his virginity when he was just shy of 14, in 1963. At the time he had a newspaper route. One winter evening just before Christmas, he delivered papers to a house where a married woman answered the door, crying, dressed only in a thin nightgown. What happened next was something Gene would later describe in detail in his autobiography. For him, that moment didn't just mark the beginning of his sex life. It became part of the legend of Gene Simmons, the man who would go on to claim thousands of conquests. By 1970, Simmons had teamed up with Paul Stanley and musicians Steve Coronel, Brooke Ostrander, and Tony Zarella to form a band called Wicked Lester. Their sound was unusual, blending rock with folk influences, reflecting the unpredictable New York City music scene of the time. They managed to record a full album at Electric Lady Studios, the legendary space built by Jimi Hendrix. Epic Records financed the project, but their A&R director, Don Ellis, hated it. He called the music messy and unfit for radio, and the album was shelved. That rejection was devastating. Simmons had poured everything into Wicked Lester, but the project was dead before it could even start. Frustrated, Simmons and Stanley fired Coronel, briefly brought in Ron Lejack, and then shut the band down completely. Years later, in 1977, when Kiss was already successful, Gene and Paul spent $138,000 to buy back the old Wicked Lester master tapes just to make sure they would never see the light of day. They worried the strange folk rock sound would clash with the harder, darker image Kiss had built. Even so, bootleg copies eventually leaked online, revealing early versions of songs like She and Love Her All I Can, which Kiss later re-recorded, without crediting the original lineup. From the ashes of Wicked Lester, a new vision was born. By early 1973, Simmons and Stanley were finished with Compromise. They were determined to create a band that wasn't just about music, but about spectacle. They found an ad in Rolling Stone placed by drummer Peter Criss, who had experience in groups like Lips and Chelsea. Soon after, they discovered guitarist Ace Frehley through an ad in the Village Voice. With this lineup complete, they created something entirely new. This wasn't going to be just another rock band. They wanted fire, blood, and fantasy. Influenced by the shock theatrics of Alice Cooper and the glam energy of the New York Dolls, they formed Kiss. Their very first show was on January 30, 1973, at a tiny Queens club called the Coventry, previously known as the Popcorn Club. Only 3 people showed up, including some of the band members' girlfriends. But that night, Simmons breathed fire on stage for the very first time. Even if the crowd was small, the act was unforgettable. At first, Kiss had no hit songs and no presence on the radio. But they built their following through raw spectacle and relentless live shows. Within just 18 months, they were headlining Anaheim Stadium in 1974. Simmons believed their strange makeup was the secret. It was shocking, memorable, and impossible to ignore. Each member developed a persona. Simmons, inspired by horror films like Black Sabbath and comic book characters like Black Bolt, became the demon. He painted black bat wings around his eyes, learned to spit blood, and perfected fire-breathing tricks from professionals. Peter Criss created the Catman with painted whiskers. Ace Frehley became the spaceman, inspired by sci-fi themes. Paul Stanley transformed into the Starchild, with his iconic star-shaped eye. They stood in front of mirrors painting themselves, inventing their alter egos without realizing they were about to redefine rock performance forever. The early crowds were tiny, sometimes no more than 10 or 15 people. But the few who saw them left talking. Even without social media, word of mouth spread like wildfire. Fans described the experience as weird, intense, and unforgettable. Simmons himself admitted the makeup felt sticky and strange, but he knew it was working. They didn't need radio airplay. They needed to be burned into people's memories. In August 1973, their big break came when television director Bill O'Coin saw Kiss perform at the Hotel Diplomat. He believed in them so strongly that he promised to get them a record deal in 2 weeks. And he delivered. By November, they signed with Casablanca Records, a brand new label founded by Neil Bogart. The band quickly recorded their self-titled debut album with producer Eddie Kramer. It was released on February 18, 1974. Sales were disappointing at first, with only 75,000 copies sold. But Kiss didn't quit. They played over 300 shows that year, sometimes 2 or 3 in a single day. Casablanca was close to bankruptcy, but Kiss's relentless touring kept both the label and the band alive. Bogart, who at first doubted the makeup gimmick, realized it was working after he saw how crowds responded. By 1975, Kiss had gone from tiny clubs to sold-out arenas, proving that shock, spectacle, and determination could outshine radio airplay. Behind the scenes, Simmons also began developing a bizarre private ritual. He started taking Polaroid photos of his sexual encounters. Each woman had to hold up the hotel room key in the photo as proof. Over the years, he claimed to have taken nearly 5,000 such pictures, boasting that he had slept with over 4,600 women. It was part ego, part obsession, and part of the larger-than-life image he was carefully crafting. Gene Simmons's obsession with documenting his private life shocked even his closest friends. He took Polaroid photos of his sexual encounters and kept them in a locked box, showing them off to guests as if they were trophies. Grace Slick of Jefferson Airplane once saw them and called the habit disgusting. Years later, after marrying Shannon Tweed in 2011, she found the infamous collection and burned it live on their reality show, putting an end to that disturbing chapter of his life. While Gene stayed away from drugs, his addiction to sex fueled his wild, larger-than-life persona on stage. From tiny clubs to massive arenas, he turned chaos into spectacle and spectacle into power. That energy exploded on September 10, 1975, when Kiss released Alive, their groundbreaking live album. The record captured the raw fire, screams, and blood of their stage shows, recorded in cities like Detroit, Cleveland, Wildwood, and Davenport. With performances from May through July that year, the album became a phenomenon, going quadruple platinum with over 4 million sales. It reached number 9 on the Billboard charts and stayed there for 110 weeks. The success didn't just save Kiss, it saved Casablanca Records, which was drowning in lawsuits and debt at the time. The title Alive was inspired by Slade's 1972 live record, and for Kiss, it proved that their wild gamble on makeup, fire, and madness had worked. The next year they pushed further with Destroyer, released on March 15, 1976. Legendary producer Bob Ezrin transformed their sound with strings, children's choirs, reverse drum tracks, and eerie effects. Shout It Out Loud became a hit, peaking at number 31, while Gene's dark anthem God of Thunder cemented his demon persona. Ezrin didn't just polish their work. He tore apart their demos, rewrote songs, rearranged parts, and even played bass on Detroit Rock City himself. He borrowed from classical music too, weaving pieces of Beethoven's Sonata Pathétique into Great Expectations. Recording sessions stretched from August 1975 through January at Electric Lady Studios. And while Gene's ego grew with the band's success, Ezrin gave their chaos structure. By the late 1970s, Kiss concerts weren't just shows, they were full-blown spectacles. The Dynasty Tour of 1979 ran for 6 months across North America with 92 shows. Gene flew across stages, Ace Frehley's guitar fired rockets, and special effects designer John Elder Robison created props that shot smoke and lit up the arenas. But despite the flash, cracks were showing. Ticket sales in some cities plummeted, forcing cancellations and downsizing. Peter Criss, struggling with drug addiction, grew unpredictable, sometimes stopping in the middle of performances. Gene later described it as self-destruction, and by the final show in Toledo, it was clear the original lineup was breaking apart. Fans noticed the shift, especially as disco crept into their sound and replaced hardcore rock energy. Families started attending instead of die-hard fans, and the band's edge began to dull. In 1978, things got even stranger.